For those of you, in this community who are new to me, my name is Lama Rod. I do use he, him pronouns. I am currently living on and teaching on what I consider my ancestral land, the land of Muskogee Creek Cherokee people, on the land that we call Atlanta, Georgia now. This is the land of my African enslaved and Black ancestors, as well as my Indigenous ancestors. And I am happy to be back on the land, um, doing what I can to ally again in this life with the land, with the earth, um, to do this great project, this amazing project of working towards this liberation, not just for myself, but liberation on behalf of all beings. So I invite you into the space, and I welcome you, and and really invite you um, to take care of yourself. As we begin our time together. You know, it's so incredibly important that um, we understand what we need, and we make the choices to gather the things, the resources that we need in order to be well right now. Um, our wellness, isn't so much about just us, but our wellness is about also what we can offer our communities, our families, our friends, our loved ones, our collectives, the world, right? I take care of myself because I need to take care of others. You know, and I can't do this work of benefiting others if I'm not experiencing some level of care. Um, so I want to remind you of this radical imperative of self-care, particularly in the spirit of Mother Audrey Lloyd, as she taught us. That self-care, you know, when working towards liberation, isn't about self-indulgence; it's about self-preservation. And our self-preservation, the labor of self-preservation, is how we wage this political warfare against systems and institutions that were created to annihilate us, to subjugate us, right? To assimilate us. And we take care of ourselves, we survive. And not only do we survive, but we thrive. Thrive in joy, we thrive in gratitude, we thrive in this union of deep clarity or wisdom, along with this ethical care, or what we call compassion, bringing both of these profound qualities and experiences together to create this force, this momentum, this energetic force, which I call bodhicitta, right? This awakened consciousness, this awakened mind, this attitude, this wish, this fierceness that I will survive and I will endure because people depend on me for their own endurance and survival. You know? So I continue doing what I can, because there are others who need me. They need me to be in the world. They need you, us, to be here, to be present. So I always need to remind myself of that. Right? When I choose to offer myself what I need, or when I choose to set boundaries, I'm making that choice because ultimately I still need to be of benefit to all beings as much as I can for as long as I can. You know, So again, so our care isn't just about us. It's about all those around us, and not just those beings who are living, embodied, in this physical realm, but it's also the beings of the formless realm, of the unseen world. Right? There's our ancestors and our descendants who also rely on us, you know, who depend on us in many ways, because this is an ecosystem. You know, the seen world and the unseen world form this coherent ecosystem, and we're a part of this ecosystem. We have roles, right? And in strict Dharma terms, we would call this ecosystem interdependence, interrelatedness. So we're a part of something larger, but the individual work that we're doing for ourselves is impacting this larger interrelatedness or this larger ecosystem. So we matter. We all matter. We're all important. We all need to be here. Wherever we are, that's where we're at. You know. So just for me, just remembering that this grand work, this grand labor, this complicated, complex labor, of deep care for ourselves as an expression of deep care for all beings. To do my labor in metabolizing grief and trauma so I can do this collective labor of supporting the metabolizing of the collective grief and trauma. Right. And this is the time, the age, the timeline that we find ourselves on these days. I call this period um, um, a period of apocalypse. It's not the apocalypse, but it is definitely an apocalypse. And this is, you know, a period of great transition, of great unveiling, of profound truth telling. Apocalypse literally means unveiling. So what we're experiencing is the unveiling of the truth of things, right? And we're getting a choice in terms of how we are being called to be in relationship to that truth. We get a choice. We get two choices actually. We either move through the struggle and engage in the struggle of being in relationship to the truth and what the truth actually calls us to do, which is to change, to grow, to transition. Or the second choice is not to engage at all. Not to hold space for this profound truth telling, but to bypass the truth telling, to somehow create a barrier between us and this profound change that's happening around us. And I think one of the primary ways, um, for those of us who are choosing to be in relationship to this unveiling, to this transition, I think one of the primary practices that we're being called into is the practice of grieving. And in case someone hasn't told you this before, I would like to offer something, a little bit of I guess I would call it the sharing of a particular truth. In the same way the Buddha shared the teachings of the Four Noble Truths, at the beginning of his teaching, his ministry, by first presenting the first noble truth that there is suffering and life, I would like to present, I think, a very current noble truth, a contemporary noble truth for us. And this noble truth is that we are supposed to be grieving now. We are supposed to be grieving. This grieving is this profound way that we're trying to figure out who we are in the midst of tremendous transition, of loss. Who am I now? What is my community? So much has changed, and now I have to change. And just giving us just a few moments to kind of sit with that, you know. I think to honor this important work of grief, we have to let it be present, to be here. You know? And for me, and maybe like you, some of you as well, I feel like I've been grieving for my whole life. Sometimes I feel like I've been grieving for all my lives in the past. I feel like I'll be grieving, in my future lives, you know. But I also understand too in my practice that this grief, this trying to relate to shifting, to change, to loss is also just one experience that I'm having. Because as I grieve, I am also experiencing joy. I'm also experiencing gratitude. Um, I'm experiencing the love of community. I'm experiencing deep care from the land. I'm experiencing community with my ancestors, and I'm experiencing excitement about my descendants. Um, there's contentment there, there's happiness there, there's groundedness there, and there's grieving. And in my grieving, there's also the sorrow and the brokenheartedness, which for me, all of this discomfort has become precious for me. You know, that's not to say that I'm fixated or attached. It means that I appreciate what these experiences are showing me about how to care for myself and how to care for others around me. There's something within grief that is calling for us to see it as not just something that we're trying to get through, not as something that's heavy, but to see it as a teacher that's arising in the moment to show us something, to free us in certain ways, to see grief and grieving as liberating. But we can't, or rather, it's very difficult to see this quality of grief if we have no support, if we have no resources. And I was raised in my community in small, rural, deep South Black community. Um, I was raised just to just do it, just endure it, just get through it. And as I got older, and particularly as I came into my Dharma practice, I began to understand how hard that was to endure the grief. That because when my framework, my theological framework growing up in church was that, we just have to get through this life. And then after this life, we'll get our reward. We'll get to heaven, you know. And when I was growing up, and particularly as I got into my teenage years, I began to understand, well, I began to actually long for heaven right now in this moment. Not after my transition into the unseen world, but I wanted that heaven, that liberation in this very moment. And I think that is what really turned my mind, right? My mind towards Buddhadharma was that promise that we could experience this spaciousness, this openness, this contentment, this vulnerability right now in the present moment, not at some later date, as a reward, that I could labor now to free myself, to free myself from the fixation, right? And the over-centering of these things that created separation, that perpetuated deep suffering for me, right? To begin to understand the nature of everything, including my mind, including the nature of all reality. And that became a resource for me. That the practice, the perspective, the philosophy became a resource for me that I called into my relationship with the grieving. And I think the energy, the work of grieving is different for all of us, and there are many different kinds of grief that we're working with and moving through. And I think that a prevalent experience of grief that many of us in this space are working with is collective grief and transhistorical grief. You know, transhistorical grief, meaning is the grief of our ancestors. It is the grief that we inherited. You know, for many of us being born into situations, conditions, right, that where we experience this level of marginalization or erasure, right, in the same way our ancestors did, right? And so we're born into this situation working with the grief that we're experiencing in our own living, in our own situation, but also the grief of all those coming who came before us. And then, of course, we contend with the possibility of passing this grief, transferring this grief into the experiences of our descendants. So this transhistorical grief is also collective grief. We're a part of a larger ecosystem of grieving right now. And um, some of us are beginning to feel the weight of that labor, because there are so many people who, for some reason, are not able to touch into the grief for themselves or for the collective. And some of us find ourselves taking up a lot of the labor of doing other people's grieving on their behalf. And then people look at us, right? And they say, oh, this just is who you are. You're just always grieving. That's who you are. You're just a grieving person. No, actually, we take on the labor, the work that so many people aren't doing. And it becomes heavy, it becomes overwhelming. And in that case, in that way, the grief begins to consume us. And I believe that our work, this authentic way of skillfully mourning and skillfully grieving, is really the path of actually consuming the grief, not the grief consuming us. And I consume grief by offering it as much space in my experience and my practice as possible. But I have to call in the supports that I need. I call in the earth. I call in beings around me, Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, and so forth, who can help me hold the space open for the grief. I call on a variety of deities. I even call on my breath, right? I call on my teachers, my mentors and guides. Right? I call on actually any being who loves me, who wants me to be well. I call all of those beings, and many of you have practiced, this with me, this calling in the form of the seven homecomings practice. So some of you have been, I know, really working with that practice. But sometimes, all we can do is just say, any being who loves me, who's looking out for me, who's protecting me, I call you into the space to help me hold what seems so difficult, so impossible to hold in this moment. That kind of direct vulnerability, which comes, I think, as an expression of deep self-care, right? Because so much of our care is about asking for help, asking to be held, asking to be tended to, asking, for others to offer resources to us that we need. That kind of asking for help is crucial. You know, when we ask for help in that way, we're practicing this really actual profound openness, this profound vulnerability, and that openness begins to facilitate a deep nourishing for us. When we open and say, I need help, please help me, we open to the resources, the energetic resources, the physical resources that we need in order to do this work of being with the grieving. And again, this is, I think, some of the primary labor that many of us will be doing for a while, is the grief. I was speaking with two very close friends today. One friend over the phone, one friend in person. And we were just sharing just this sense that so many of us are overwhelmed, that so many of us are just going through it right now. Um, and there is this sense that people are drowning in the grief. And we just talked about, just supporting each other. Like, we just talked about our practice and what we were doing and what we could do further to support one another, right? We also talked about this really hard truth. And I've said this often before. If you read anything that I've written, I've said this quite a few times. And that is that not all of us are going to make it. And that is a realization that I have to mourn. in my practice. I have to grieve that no matter how enlightened and realized I get, we're just very slow work. By the way, you may have realized that in your practice, very slow going, getting woke, right? But no matter how woke I become, no matter how realized I become, I'm not going to save everyone. I have to mourn that. I have to allow the sadness to rise, the disappointment, the frustration, anger to rise, to surface within my mind. And that is the overwhelming contradiction of samsara. You know? Samsara is nothing but one contradiction after the other. And even the contradictions we have to mourn. And in that mourning, we continue to open our hearts. We keep our hearts open. We keep our hearts broken and raw, right? That openness, the tenderness of the heart keeps us connected to the struggle, to the experiences of all beings, both in the seen world and unseen world, both. And even though there are people that I won't be able to save, even though there are people who won't do the work, the labor, for many reasons, whatever those reasons are, I still keep my heart open. And part of the work, or part of my role moving through this life, I would say purpose. So part of my purpose moving through this life, moving through this timeline is to mourn, to grieve for people, to grieve for them, to grieve with them, to acknowledge who and what they are, and to acknowledge that regardless, that they're still important, that they're still a part of this profound ecosystem. I think one of the most I think one of the most um, radical things right now that we can do is to grieve openly, publicly, without apology, and to say, this is part of my work. Yes, there will always be the work of dismantling and disrupting and dreaming and organizing and remembering all that work. Yes, all that work has to continue, but there has to be some of us that are doing and holding the space through the labor of grieving. Somehow our grief marks the passage, the change, the transition. It recognizes the lives that are a part of this transition. It recognizes those of us who may not make it in this transition. And when I say not make it, it doesn't mean, I'm not saying that people are going to die. I mean that in this moment, they may not be ready to move through this transition, but the next moment or a moment down the road, there's always possibility. There's always potential for every being to get free. Maybe not at the same time. You know, we're all on different timelines moving towards this enlightenment. And some of us are going to get there well before others will. And that's what we're recognizing. And that's part of the grief, that as we continue to do our work and really try to help those around us who are also committed to the work, people will be left behind. Beings will be left behind. And it's okay. Because I think that the closer we get to enlightenment, and when we actually get to enlightenment, we will have this profound capacity to come back and get people, to come back and really do this profound work of really, really inspiring people to do the work of liberation. I think that's part of what keeps the bodhisattva moving, is that the more awakened the bodhisattva becomes, the deeper the capacity of the bodhisattva to awaken others. And the bodhisattva awakens others through example, through embodiments, through radical care for themselves, and manifesting that same care outwardly towards others. We do not have any being, actually, regardless of if a being is a bodhisattva or a Buddha, you know, regardless, no being, we don't have the capacity to drag people to liberation. Liberation has to be an individual act of consent, that we all have to consent individually to the labor of liberation. And our consent is expressed through engaging in practice. And the basic practice of this path is developing a sharp, deep, fierce awareness of our minds. That's all we're doing, no matter what the practice is, no matter if it's chanting, rituals, asanas, no matter what it is, the goal is to develop and awaken this awareness. To awaken this awareness and to deepen the care for others who are still struggling to even understand what this awareness is. Okay, I think we can continue. Welcome back, everyone. I would just like to just move into just some practice, and again, the focus of our practice is just around grounding, around really just practicing with calling in resources that we need right now to do this labor of being with the grief. And it's, and I use this phrase, holding space. I'm trying to think of different ways to express this, but really it's about allowing space to hold everything, including the grief. I think sometimes there's a subtle, nuanced thing that we're doing of like trying to somehow, we're doing much more labor than we need to do, I think. And some of you have heard me say this a couple of times, but we're trying to kind of shift into allowing our practice to do more labor for us instead of us doing so much labor in the practice. It's very nuanced. kind of perspective. And that's something that has been really important for me for this period, this past year. How do I allow my practice to do this work? And which to allow our practice means that we're developing a deeper trust in the practice, that the practice can actually hold us, that the practice can hold whatever we're struggling to hold for ourselves, and that somehow I have to come into a deeper allowance of that to happen. But for me, you know, I am really interested in just allowing my practice to care for me. To care for me. Let your practice care for you, because many of us are desperately needing care right now. And for me, first and foremost, I take refuge in my practice. Wherever it may be in the moment, that's where I'm taking refuge in, to allow the practice just to tend to me, to hold me, right? To offer some sense of spaciousness around whatever it is I'm struggling to be in a relationship with. So I'm gonna just let's begin. Let's begin. And as always, as we begin our practice, I invite you to allow your bodies to be in a position that feels appropriate for you. So wherever it may be, lying down, standing up. And I just kind of check in. I just check in with my body and say, okay, how do we need to be right now? And if I wasn't leading the practice, I would be lying down on my back. Of course, that wouldn't be good because in 5 minutes I would be asleep. So what's appropriate for me is to stay upright right now. But I offer you permission to do whatever it is. If you need to take a nap, if you need to go to sleep, please do so. And moving into the practice, I'm going to offer some instruction around the breath. If the breath is not accessible for you, I just invite you to just shift your attention, anchor your attention to something that feels more neutral, more grounding for you in the practice. Okay. But we'll begin. So after we've come into a position that feels appropriate for us, I just invite you to reflect on just any intentions that you may have coming into the practice. Why are you practicing? Why do you practice at all? It doesn't matter what the practice is. Why do you practice in general? And that's our intention. You know, why do we practice anything in this particular path? So allow that intention to kind of to arise within your awareness. And we're gonna actually dedicate the merit right now before we even begin getting to the practice. I invite you just imagine that whatever benefit that you experience in this practice, that is instantly offered out towards the liberation. When it's offered out towards the liberation of all beings, we're not losing anything. So don't feel as if you're going to get depleted, but whatever helps me, I pray that it instantly begins to help others. If you feel resourced enough, I invite you now to shift your attention to the breath. And if not the breath, into a sensation that feels neutral or grounding. If you are working with the breath, I invite you just to notice the in breath and the out breath. Just noticing the breath in the moment, as if we're being introduced to the breath for the first time. We're saying, hello, how are you? If you want to move deeper into the breath, I invite you just to allow the breath to elongate, to deepen. So taking your time to deeply inhale, taking your time and extending the exhale. And sometimes when we deepen the breath, we'll begin to experience just new material, new things beginning to kind of loosen themselves and beginning to come uncovered. Whatever comes uncovered as we deepen the breath, I invite you just to allow it to arise into the space, the openness of your mind, which is already naturally open and spacious and boundless. These thoughts, these emotions, these narratives just rise up into the space of the mind like the smoke from incense rising up into the space of a room. Just watching it and letting it go. And if we are beginning to connect to experiences of grief and how we understand grief for ourselves, again, allowing this experience of grief to rise up into the spaciousness of the mind, just letting it go, giving it lots of space to be, letting the space take care of everything. And again, if there's some need for grounding or context, return back to this aspiration that whatever is benefiting me may it also benefit all beings. When you're ready, I invite you to shift your attention to your heart center. I invite you to imagine breathing in and out of the heart center if your breath is still accessible for you. As we're breathing in and out of the heart center, I invite you to connect to your experiences of gratitude. And we can do that by reflecting on something or someone that we're grateful for, or reflecting in general on all the labor and the kindness that is continually being offered to us for our well-being. We're awakening gratitude. I love to imagine this energy awakening in the heart center. As we breathe in and out of the heart center, we begin to really deeply ignite and feed this energy of gratitude. That regardless of everything that's happening, there's something I'm grateful for. And this practice of gratitude opens our hearts, opens our mind, facilitates a deeper experience of spaciousness. So allowing the gratitude to awaken, and in its awakening, it begins to actually hold more of this experience of grief. And we may not be grateful for the grief, but there's gratitude for something else. And that gratitude for something else expresses itself as a resource to take care of our grief. And when you're ready, I encourage you to shift your attention down to the seat. Or if you're standing, noticing the weight of your body making contact with the floor under you. Noticing the sensation of the weight of the body making contact with the surface under you. Allowing that anchor to take care or ground your attention. As we move deeper into the practice, I just also want to just to let you know if there's some place in the practice that feels like it's really tending to you, is really caring for you, and you're hesitant to leave that space, please stay there. Please stay in whatever stage of the practice is really meeting your needs. If you would like to continue, I invite you to shift your attention. So your attention, this energy of knowingness, right? To shift this attention down into the earth, the land, where the energy of our attention begins to touch into the energetic expression of the land, of the earth. And allowing this expression of the land, the earth, to hold, to tend to your attention. And just exploring that for a couple of moments. What is it? What is your experience of becoming attentive to not just the physical expression of the earth, but also the energetic expression of the earth, the land? And as you're touching the earth, the land under you, I invite you to begin to shift, to share this energy of gratitude down into the earth. That we're sharing this gratitude into the earth, and we're beginning to imagine that the land, the earth begins to be filled with this deep gratitude. That we are grateful for this land. And slowly the land, the earth is awakened, becomes conscious as we share this gratitude with it. And as the earth becomes more and more awakened, we begin to experience the earth slowly beginning to hold some of this grief that we're experiencing with us, beginning to feel the earth support us and holding our brokenheartedness, our sorrow. And can we experience, can we feel this foundation of the earth rising to meet and to care for our grief? Just spending a few more moments just exploring this practice of allowing the earth to help us, to tend to us in our grief. And as the earth is helping us to hold this grief, we make an aspiration that the earth rises for all beings as an agent of support, helping to tend to the grief that so many of us are struggling to be in relationship with. And slowly we begin to transition out of our practice. We begin by shifting our attention back to our seats, or our bodies making contact with the surface under us. Noticing the weight of our bodies, noticing the sensation of our bodies being held by something. I invite you to just begin to offer gratitude to the different elements of your practice that seemed helpful. I like to offer always gratitude to the earth, gratitude to my seat, gratitude to my body, gratitude to my breath, gratitude to my mind, gratitude to my teachers, guides, ancestors, and mentors. Appreciation to my community, to all the communities I'm a part of, especially this community right now, this virtual community. And offer gratitude also back to ourselves, to the totality of who we are in this realm, in this body. Offering gratitude for our work, our diligence, our labor. And again, whatever has been a benefit to us in this practice, we pray, we aspire that all beings can benefit in the same way that we have. And that one day all of us will be free. And until we achieve that freedom, may we all in this moment have what we need in order to be well, safe, and happy. So now, fully stepping out of the practice, if your eyes were closed, slowly beginning to open your eyes, allowing your body to reawaken through slow, simple movements, whatever seems appropriate for you in this moment. Just inviting our bodies back into the space. Thank you. I thank you for your practice and for your labor. And also remind you that as you grieve, to know that we are all grieving together. Right. I think right now, um, we're being called into a particular kind of labor to change right now. Um, and to let go of the things that we don't need and to actually beginning to do this profound work of embodying, living this dream of liberation, right? To actually beginning to bring this dream into fruition. Like, how do we want to live? How do we want to be in a relationship with each other? What what is our work now? You know, and so there are those of us who are just really going through this, really trying to figure out, how do I change? How do I begin to embody the dream? How do I start dreaming liberation and really bringing it about? So when I say that people aren't going to make it, it means there are people who just aren't doing that. They're not engaging in this labor right now. They're choosing to stay where they are. And that creates a kind of division, a divide. And we've already been seeing this over, for a while. Many of us have already been experiencing this. You know, um, there are people who are just going to just continue doing exactly what they're doing. And then there are those of us who are like in this messiness of trying to change. You know, and when you're engaged in that labor, you start creating a different reality, right? A different communities, different ways of belonging, right? Um, and I think that's really the basic practice of getting free, is always engaging in that labor of change, of letting go. Um, so to say that someone isn't going to make it isn't this finite thing. It's not like, oh, they're never going to make it. It's just right now, at this moment, they're not doing the labor in this grand transition that we're moving through. So that's what I would say to elaborate on that. And some of us have had to I'll just speak for myself. I've had to really let go of some relationships where the labor isn't being done. There's still a deep love, but I can't be in a relationship with folks right now who aren't a part of this liberation work right now. I mean, on one hand, there's no weaving to be done. It just kind of is. There's a false division. There's that division is an illusion. I think that division comes from the ways that, I mean, many of us have come through traditions, upbringings, and so forth, trauma, that has somehow cast the erotic as not sacred, when in fact the erotic is an expression of the sacred. Um, but I would say for me, just my, some of my work that I've been doing for myself is to understand how important pleasure and desire is. I think we get into these spaces, you know, where desire is like cast in such a negative light when desire is actually imperative. Desire is imperative to freedom work and liberation work. I have to want to be free. I have to be really attached to that in order to get free. Um, you know, and that my desire can be used to call into like my space, my life, the resources needed to get free. You know, but more specifically with pleasure, pleasure becomes a doorway into the nature of reality itself. If we can just allow ourselves to experience the pleasure and not feel guilty about it. And that doorway into, to the nature of things, that's just really just tantric. That's tantric philosophy, that pleasure can be used as a path into liberation. Because pleasure is just another experience, but that a particular experience is full of energy, right? And that energy can be harnessed to actually awaken these expressions of consciousness. But we have to be trained in that. We have to be trained. We have to decenter a kind of selfishness in our pleasure, where pleasure isn't just about me, it's about us, right? It's about how are we experiencing this pleasure. I feel that often for many of us, so anger is a secondary emotion. I think grief can be considered a primary emotion. Um, so that anger can distract us from the grief, as well, because anger is even though it's a secondary emotion, is a very potent emotion, right? And then just kind of we find ourselves reacting to the anger. That reactivity to anger takes us out of actually being with the grief and working with the grief and moving with the grief. And we just tend to be just reacting to the anger, creating more anger, and so forth and so on. So when we're working with grief, everything, of course, especially the grief, but everything just needs to be seen and named and experienced. And when we experience something, we move into the space of responsiveness. We start responding. And responding means that we're choosing, a response to the material in our own minds and experiences. Hopefully, we're choosing a response that reduces harm and violence, not perpetuating it. Um, but it's important that we understand that anger it accompanies our grief. If we can see that, the anger is transformed into really an expression of love for the grief. And this is how I understand it in my practice. I think anger is trying to take care of us and our grief by arising and saying that there's something that we need to take care of, and it's not the anger, but it's actually the primary experience that's beneath the anger. I think loss is a disruption to the ego, the sense of self. Because the ego, the sense of self, it uses other things around it to create a sense of autonomy or a sense of identity. So if we know what that is, we can figure out what we are or what I am. But when this situation, people, a thing, or whatever it may be, when that disappears, it goes away, it transitions, then there is and this disruption of ego in the moment, trying to figure out, okay, wait, what am I now? Who am I? And how do I solidify myself now when the thing or the person that I've been using to stabilize his sense of self has been disrupted, has gone, has disappeared. Um, and I know that there's a lot of work around, a lot of teaching around, how like grief is like love that's um, looking to be expressed or something along those lines. But in a more deeper dharmic sense, it's about sense of self and who am I, you know, um, and that what we're trying to figure out is, okay, I how do I let myself change and become different now that this person, this thing has transitioned, has changed, has disappeared, has gone. And in this period of grieving, I think that's the work that we're trying to do, you know, to solidify a sense of self again.